I just specifically didn't use the industrial category or the commercial category because I'll tell you what we have done for our largest user is we've taken their actual rate and compared it with the similar actual rate that Consumers Energy has, and they would actually save 10% by shifting rates from, if they are saving 10% on our rates as compared to equivalent rates that they would be charged for the exact same kilowatt hour usage pattern.
I'm not talking about consumers. I'm talking about these 40 publicly owned facilities.
And that's what I'm telling you. Okay, so the lowest rate, if you look on this for all three categories or four categories, residential, commercial, industrial, and total, is the city of Zeeland, which, as you know, I have a lot of history about it. Now, the reason for them being that low is because, particularly in the industrial category, their average industrial customer is not at all like our average industrial customer. So if you want to look at the system as a whole and say, what is the total kilowatt hours divided? But if you want to get into a customer by customer comparison, this, admittedly, is not the way to do it.
Yeah.
I am just trying to give you a general indication of the total revenues that we collect per kilowatt hour and compared to the total kilowatt hours that others collect. Now, if you have a utility, some of these municipal utilities are primarily residential, and they could have a very, very low industrial rate, but only have one industrial customer, and that would skew the total category into the residential category. It's not every utility is not created equal. So that's what I'm saying is when you're making these comparisons, what I'm trying to do is give you a data point, a single data point, and this is by no means the only way that I would compare rates, but this is a mechanism to compare the total dollars that we are collecting and compared to the total sales that we have. And that's why I've given you the information. I give it to you every year. It is a single data point and should not be utilized to suggest that one particular customer may have either that amount of savings or that amount of costs in comparison to similar customers on other utility rates. You cannot make that comparison from this sheet.
Well, what you're telling me then is APP Power, or the American Public Power Association, really is putting out information that is misleading. I have a hard time with that, Dave.
If you look at the bottom of the sheet, what it says is APPA collected this data from the forms that we all fill out as utilities and send to the federal government. It's not misleading at all. It's just intentionally, you have to understand the report that they're taking this data from and what that report says. And that report basically requires all utilities to send in a report to the federal government that says, this is the total amount of money that I collected, and this is our total kilowatt hour sales.
We could probably go through, we could get really into the weeds here and go through a number of these different communities and find out exactly what the parameters were in terms of each of the categories. And I'm not proposing we do that. But what I am saying is, you're saying this data is misleading. Why did you even pass it out?
I did not say the data is misleading. I did not say that, John. I said
then let's look at the industrial situation on this data. If that's true.
I am saying that you need to recognize where the data was collected and how the data was collected to understand some of the differences, particularly in those two rate classes. That's why I suggested those two rate designations do not match up with particular rate categories at the various utilities. We don't, as Grand Haven does not have a quote industrial rate. It has a primary rate that some of the customers are commercial and some of the customers are industrial. So
Well, it's got a commercial and an industrial section,
what's that?
this report.
What are you asking?
I said this report is showing commercial and industrial.
And those,
It's showing the two categories.
I'm understanding, but no utilities sell power to, they don't have a commercial rate and they don't have an industrial rate. They have a primary rate and a secondary rate. And if you have a large customer like Meyer that's classified as a commercial customer, they are on our best primary rate, similar to what Shape is. So there would be rate customer classes, commercial customers in both our primary and secondary rates. There would be industrial customers in both our primary and secondary rates. And depending on what type of customers you have, you might have large customers that are primarily comprising the industrial rate category that are skewing the numbers. And that's all I'm saying. You have to understand the data to understand what you're reading. And I don't want people
Dave, are you saying that they're not taking the sales data, which ours is broken up into residential, commercial, and industrial, and dividing it by the number of kilowatt hours sold for that category? You're saying they're not doing that?
No, they are doing that.
Well, okay.
But John, we do not have, and what I'm saying is you should know this, we do not have a commercial rate. We do not have an
We have a commercial category, Dave.
Right. So if you look at the data that I give you every month, we separate out the classification, the type of customer, but their rates within that category are not the same because they are.
I'm not under the impression these are rates. These are average revenues. They're not
Correct.
rates.
Correct. That is a perfect analogy of what you're looking at. You're not comparing rates. You're comparing sales numbers in different classification.
That's right.
And that's why you can't use that information.
In terms of the industrial category, we're making more money than 83% of the people that have
no, that's not that. See,
publicly owned facility.
You can't make that discussion. You cannot make that comparison because what I'm suggesting to you is let's pull that information up for Grand Haven. We have, I'm on in the consent agenda right there. If you look at this number, Grand Haven has, it says it's industrial.
7.1.
It's industrial rate
7.1,
category. I understand. It's industrial rate category for those that are listening is 11.1 cents per kilowatt hour.
That's what we're earning.
No,
that's our revenue.
That's our total revenue.
Not a rate. It's not a rate. It's revenue.
Now, if I did that same comparison for individual customers, I would have some customers that are up that might have an empty industrial building that are just using it for lighting and don't have a very high load factor, and they got a high demand or low demand energy utilization rate. They could be paying 15 cents a kilowatt hour.
It's an average, Dave.
Yeah,
it's an average.
Look at Harbor Springs. Look at Harbor Springs. Do you really think they are selling industrial customers energy for 1 cent a kilowatt hour? You believe that? What's happening there is...
I would guess it's a typo, Dave.
No, it's not a typo. It's probably explainable because Harbor Springs, almost all of their sales, because they don't have any industry up there,
Well, there you go. There you go.
are on their on their residential rate class. That's why their residential rate average is so close with their total average. And what they're doing is they probably have one industrial customer that has really had a lot of sales, and for some reason their revenues weren't properly allocated. So it's not a typo.
Well, we can argue about this, and let's not waste any more time on it. I'm telling you, I disagree with your analysis.
It's not my analysis. It's
it
not
is.
my numbers. I'm trying to point
I'm
out.
talking about your statement in your report.
In my report, the only category that I looked at was total revenues. That's what my point is. So there is no misstatements. There's nothing to disagree with. The only thing I am saying in my report is if you look at the total revenues that we collect in comparison to the total sales, we are above the municipal average, above the public.
Yeah, we're in the top 40%, Dave.
What's that?
That's where we are.
We're not 40% above that.
I'm telling you,
total.
62% of those 40 facilities their number is lower than ours. Their average revenue number per kilowatt hour is lower than ours.
And that is an unweighted average. That's not how they calculate that number on the top.
It worked both
Number
ways.
on the top is a weighted average. In other words, it's looking at all of the revenues collected. So a utility like Daggett in the UP does not have any impact on that weighted average because it's so small. It's an improper analysis to suggest that 62% of the sales in the state of Michigan are at lower rates than ours. That is an improper.
No, I did not say that, Dave. What I said was that 62% of these 40 companies, their average revenue per kilowatt hour as on this list is lower than ours. That's what I told you.
Okay, John. I think what we need to do is, first of all, the reason I gave this and the reason I talked about this is for exactly this reason. There's a lot of people out there that are trying to do, quote, rate analysis.
Not talking about rates.
And
Talking about revenue per kilowatt hour.
I understand that, but there's a lot of people, there's statements being made that our rates are out of whack. They're totally uncompetitive, just like you just said.
I did not say that, and I have not said that in the community.
Okay,
Don't
well,
put words in my mouth.
we do have people that are saying that. Now, in fact, what we said at the last meeting was our largest customers' rates are higher than other rates, comparable rates on other utilities. That's what was said. Now, some of us have to clean up the mess when that's said, because that's not true. So that's all I'm saying is when we make these rate comparisons and we make statements, they need to be based on fact. And when you're using these types of calculations and you make assumptions, the assumptions have to be consistent with the data you're reviewing. And there's people that spend, there's a lot of people that spend a lot of time on rate analysis and rate comparisons.
I'm talking about rates, and I didn't make any assumptions. I just took the
I didn't say
data that was
that. I said
provided.
there's people out there that are. In fact, there's people that have met with our largest customer and fed them the wrong information. So that's what I'm trying to correct.
Why don't you provide to the board the industrial rates for the communities around us that have publicly owned power facilities? Why don't you do that? Then we'll talk. Okay?
Let's move on. We can do that, John. That's really not a problem.
Ready to vote?
All those in favor say aye.
We voted?
Is this on the consent agenda, correct?
Yes.
Correct.
Aye. Yes.
Okay.
Aye.
Motion is carried. Public comment.
For those of you on Zoom, if you'd like to make a public comment, please raise your hand in the Zoom functions. M. Brooks, go ahead. M. Brooks. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
There we go. Okay, go.
All right. Yeah, my name's Paul Brooks. I live on 18143 Cherokee Court over in South Holiday Hills. This week, I believe we started, or the board and power started a, what we were told in the mailing was going to be a tree trimming event. And it has now basically become, you know, for lack of a better word, clear cutting event where I would think, and it's been admitted that it's been 15 years since they've come through our neighborhood and done the necessary trimming. And in that time, these trees have matured to the point where now their way of looking at it is they're going to have to just chop down all these trees that have been so much of our backyards and everything like that. And we understand the easement concerns and how you do these things, but the lack of, you could just say, care to these areas for 15 years, admitted by Randy that they haven't been in our yard. And that, so now they're a thing they have to get through because they have to have access and all these things. They're just going to cut down these pine trees and this like that. And we can see there's a lot of that can be happening. Okay. But I think with proper trimming through the years, we wouldn't be in a situation now where we've been through 2 yards so far, maybe 3 or 4. And my yard is like an 8/10 of an acre on a corner, kind of oddly shaped. And they're going to run these machines like bucket trucks and things on our dunes. And we're in dune grass here. And that's like fragile types of things where, you know, they can lay down boards and they're on inclines. And I just don't see how they can just say, well, we're just going to have to cut these down totally. And it's like, well, that's, you know, and the only way they're looking at it is from ease of getting it done from their neglect for 15 years. And then we as a homeowner, taxpayer, we're just left to say, okay, fine. Okay, so I'm meeting with him at 9 o'clock before he actually gets into the meats of my yard. But that's just starting the way Cherokee Road all the way down, bordering Hiawatha. They're going to go, I would say, a quarter mile through people's yards, indiscriminately just going at it from their, you know, and good, just basically clear cutting. And I just think there had to be a better way of doing this. The little postcard reminder was just said trim work. Okay. So yeah, fine. Yeah, we know how sometimes they go up in there and sometimes it can be radical as necessary. But basically they've gone through the first 2 houses here and just right down to the ground on these trees. And, you know, they have the, you know, you have the easement and all that stuff. But if you take that time and all that stuff, where were these concerns? We've been here 25 years. They've been out here maybe once for any worthwhile trimming, but and maybe another time for like hardly anything. And then now it's gotten to the point where they're just going to cut down. And I think there has to be a better way. And that's all I got to say.
Thank you very much.
Customer iPad.
This is Joe Maspero. Do you hear me?
Yes, if you could say your name and address, that'd be great.
Okay. Joe Massbaro, 17557 Park Place Circle. It is in Spring Lake, Ferrisburg, connected to Coast Guard Park. And as many of you might be aware, our condo association, if you look at it, where we're at, actually dealt with significant flooding issues, which is not necessarily part of the electrical company. However, I have had a couple of conversations with Randy, whom is very respectful. Randy, who works for you, very, very concerned about the lack of care of the perspective of what's going to happen with a particular electrical line that is along the bike path and at our homeowners association property line. So Park Place Circle has endured massive amount of issues. And the way I understand it is that basically, like the gentleman that spoke before, was basically a 30-foot clear cut to have total access to the electrical line that is behind our place. Our property line is basically for the condo association at the electrical line. And honestly, we've been managing tree issues for our own self-interest. For somebody to come through after living in this very distinct area for 20 plus years, and to just think that we have been communicated that it is going to be like a clear cut, and we've been watching what's happening on Cherokee, is completely irresponsible and not sustainable. And honestly, disgustable that I have been trying to deal with. How do you surgically manage the electrical line, which obviously we all know and appreciate? So it's not like a total environmental. However, there is significant concerns based on how that line will be maintained, because what I've heard is unconscionable. And we're dealing with the Coast Guard Park, who has already dealt with multiple complications. And then I'm hearing that, oh, we haven't maintained these lines in whatever period of time. And the particular line that is right near our association actually goes under the dune between the bike path in Coast Guard Park and North Shore, I'm assuming. And I would like to suggest that instead of just coming and clear cutting, if you've ever walked the bike path in Coast Guard Park, that maybe there are other solutions. There could be underground solutions. There could be higher pole solutions. I will tell you that our particular area that Joe Bush from Ottawa County is investigating, based on the massive, massive flooding that we dealt with in May, is most of the water issues in this particular area, when you cut out the trees, you're going to remove the transpiration rate, which is far higher and most important for the trees. And I am highly concerned that it's not about the trees so much as I am an environmentalist. And I do know that there are important protocols and easements for the lines and safety protocols. I get all of that, but the clear stripping that's being done, instead of being surgical, I would just ask that whatever process that needs to be done be paused and look at a possible remedy of trying to reduce that to be surgical. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else?
Jerry? Can you hear me?
Go ahead, John.
Jerry? We received an email from Ryan Cotton that he wanted read in the meeting minutes, or read into the meeting. Do you have that?
Do we have any other, before we?
Email from Ryan Cotton, 515 Park Avenue. Please begin to reflect the values of Grand Haven's younger population and only invest in renewables going forward. Secondly, back off from the office and industrial development ideas on Harbor Island. The vision of preserving the waterfront for future generations, which Mayor Creason started in 1962, could be further enshrined by your positive actions thereby. This is the first thing Dr. Creason explained to me upon my first arrival in Grand Haven by way of a community tour. If the new BLW administration, who is also new to town, would like to contact me, I would be happy to take them on a similar tour so they can see the result of Dr. Creason's vision. I would like this read into the public record at the upcoming board meeting.
If there are no other comments, we'll close the public session. General Manager's report.
Actually, there's somebody I can see who's physically waving, not necessarily waving through Zoom.
Is this the
Rob,
same?
could you check Willow Fisher?
Okay, I'm unmuted, correct?
Go ahead, Willow.
Okay. We bought this property specifically, I am Willow Fisher at 17567 Park Place Circle in Spring Lake, Ferrisburg, also on the other side of Coast Guard Park. And we bought this property specifically for the trees, etc. I have concerns that if we have a clear cut, that the worth of our property will go down considerably. Mr. Masbaro mentioned that there is a trail or a biking, an actual tarred path behind us that is only a matter of a few feet from the line all the way along. I'd like to suggest that perhaps they could save you money and us angst by perhaps widening it, because it's my understanding you need 30 feet 15 on either side of the line. You could easily drive right in there because it's all cleared for most of this condo along the Coast Guard Park. It's already cleared. If you just needed to widen it a little bit, it would put you right at the lines, the electrical lines that go by.
To the west of the
Oh,
line.
to the west of the line, the poles and the lines. Yeah, the path is to the west of the lines. Okay, so that, besides going possibly underneath and digging a path through, and there's already this path, perhaps they could clear or trim to the either side of that path and bring it in, rather than going 15 and 15 on each side, which would nearly wipe out every tree that we have behind us. And that's the reason we purchased it and don't want to lose the value of our home as well. That's my concern, and I surely wish that you could consider it at this particular time. We are, all of us are extremely anxious here. Thank you.
Is there so I think the other, there's a couple hands raised of people that have already talked. I think we've provided more than ample opportunity for those individuals to talk. I would like to just maybe address en masse. We understand your concerns regarding tree trimming. It's not a problem that we have not experienced before. So I think maybe what we need to do is, first of all, we give everyone an opportunity to maybe talk to, and rather than have 15 different discussions and during a public meeting of the board, it probably would be entirely appropriate to have some sort of meeting out on site on some of these, maybe on several different locations within the site with the property owners. I think we all need to understand, though, that the suggestion that we're surgical in places and non-surgical in other places is exactly what our tree trimmers are trained to do. All right. So the problem is that, yes, we can, certain areas, we can trim a tree back 3 or 4 feet. Other areas, we need to take the tree out. And it's hard for us to make that determination here. We typically depend on the people out in the field that are trained, and the people that are making those decisions here are the same people that are making decisions elsewhere on our system that a tree can be trimmed and not taken down. So I think part of the problem is admittedly that when a utility does not trim trees in a particular area for a long period of time, it does create problems. And admittedly, apparently, before most of our time here in the room, there were decisions made to postpone tree trimming in this particular area, potentially because people didn't want it. And when people don't want tree trimming and don't want to maintain trees, then we let things go, and then they get to a point where we have to take them down. So maybe we need a discussion, a frank one, about what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done. If board members want to participate in that or be involved in it, but we probably do need, I think the idea of pausing further work and having a discussion out there in the next several days is probably a good one. And we would love to hear ideas. This is not something that we haven't dealt with before. We did have another situation where, people didn't want a particular tree trimmed, and there was some alternatives, but the alternatives cost those people a lot of money, and they were willing to do that to save the tree that it was saved. But at the same token, moving the line or undergrounding the line is probably not an option given the cost. And the BLP has the responsibility to not reconfigure lines every time we encounter tree trimming. We have a responsibility to trim them. And we have the rights to do so consistent with prudent management of those. So I think before we start making judgments on what's right, wrong, or otherwise, we probably should be having a discussion If the notice or whatever offended anybody, or there was no intention here, we're doing the same thing here that we do throughout the system in the same time frame. But we are in a position as a utility, just to explain to everyone, is we are in a position where the board has aggressively approved a increased tree trimming program over the last several years because we have fell so far behind in our tree trimming. In our normal stated practice in our policies are once every 5 years, and it did not occur. For many, many years, we were not on a 1 in 5 schedule. We are trying to get back on a 1 in 5 schedule, but there are areas of our system that have not been tree trimmed in a lengthy period of time. And that's causing us to do some of these more aggressive techniques to get rid of the trees near the power lines and maintain the required clearances that we're required to maintain. In some of these trees, if we trim them or cut or remove the foliage to gain the necessary clearance and cut them back, the tree would probably be so destroyed that it wouldn't survive the cutting. So we could leave it standing, but it would be not a pretty tree. So when that's made, when that problem happens, so if we could, we'll take the information down. If we could have, I know he's not going to appreciate this, but we could have some of these people that are concerned call our office tomorrow during working hours, and we could set up a time with the distribution supervisor, the tree trimming supervisor, and some of the people that have made the decision that these trees have to be removed. I think that's a starting point to explain why those decisions have been made and what alternatives we might have to address the concerns that were addressed here tonight. So rather than to try to do that at this board meeting, I think it is appropriate to have that done on site with the appropriate personnel present. And if we could, I think we have your name and addresses here, but if you could call in tomorrow and give us your phone numbers and some contact information so that we can set up these meetings, I think that would be the next step that we can do to move these forward.
General Manager's report.
General Manager's report is short this meeting. It really contains 3 purchase orders and then a presentation from MPPA. I know Pat's on the phone, so the first item on the General Manager's report is just approve $72,000 of basically transformer and transformer pad mount boxes on your agenda from the utilities stated, or from the vendor stated.
This time I'd like a motion.
So moved.
I'll second.
Are we supposed to be having roll call votes here since we're on Zoom?
We normally would have a roll call vote, but in light of the fact that there's only 3 rollers here, we're just doing it. Would you prefer a different way?
Oh, Jack never got on?
No, Jack is not on. So we just have 3 individuals. We can see you all on, and we can,
Okay. All right.
I mean, we can have a roll call vote if that's what you'd like. And we probably should. We probably should have a roll call vote. That's probably
Roll call it is.
Thanks, John.
Director Crum,
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Director Nasser,
Yes.
Director Witherell,
Yes.
All right. If Pat's on, sorry it took us so long, Pat, but hopefully you're still on.
Mute.
There.
There we go. You hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I was not able to get the system to unmute me. Dave, would you like me to just get rolling or any preamble?
Maybe I can, I'll give you a little introduction here. Pat
Okay.
Bowen, the General Manager and CEO of the Michigan Public Power Agency. For those people on the phone, I think our board understands Michigan Public Power Agency is what we call a joint action agency in the state of Michigan. They provide service to, I believe, 22 municipal utilities now. Pat will probably explain that a bit more here in just during his presentation. But for the most part, joint action agencies were set up to supply power to their members. So we had asked Pat to come in tonight and spend some time with the board going through kind of his activities at MPPA and how they benefit us. We haven't utilized their services in Grand Haven to the extent that maybe some other municipalities in the state of Michigan are, because we generated so much of our power. But that's changing, so we thought it would be appropriate that Pat come in and give us a presentation and answer some questions of the board. So you should, for those on the phone, we're trying to get the, still there. Okay, so does everyone see the, Pat, can you see the your presentation up?
Yes, I can. Yep.
And Rob will walk you through your prompt, so it's all yours.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Dave. I think it's been over a year or more since I've gave a presentation to the city, and maybe even longer, but to the Grand Haven board itself. So I'm just going to run through a history of the agency, how we're structured, and then obviously spend most of the time on what and how we're performing services for Grand Haven, and the future of our agency, and how Grand Haven may participate in that. So just a quick little factoid about Public Power Michigan. There's 40 municipal electric utilities in Michigan, and it's roughly about 10% of the electric load in the state. Joint action agencies were formed in the 70s, I believe. In the 70s and 80s, about 55 joint action agencies were formed, and there's a lot of good reason for that. You had the oil embargo, rising wholesale prices, and a big focus on domestic energy resources. And at that time, the lowest cost form of producing electricity was from large baseload coal plants. And that is exactly what MPPA ended up investing in back in the late 70s, early 80s. So the agency was formed under Act 448, which was enabling legislation in 1976, and then was later formed in 1978. And so joint action agencies, particularly back then, were really designed to finance, build, or take ownership interest in large baseload power plants, and have evolved significantly since that date. There's 3 joint action agencies in Michigan, MPPA being by far the largest. We have 22 members, MSCPA has 5, and then WPPI, which is in the UP of Michigan, has the public power utilities only up in the UP. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the agency was formed in 1978. There's 22 full members. We represent about 85% of the Michigan municipal electric sales and about 90% of the municipal owned generation. We operate in 2 wholesale markets, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator and PJM, which is in the southwest corner of the state. And the agency owns coal, natural gas, and transmission assets, as well as contractual arrangements for landfill gas, solar, and wind. Next slide. So we're a project-based agency. There's really 2 types of joint action agencies in the United States. There's an all requirements agency, and very similar to a retail customer on your system that you were debating earlier, where the public power utility gets a rate basically from the joint action agency, and any resources that they had are usually pledged to the joint action agency, and they buy in basically to all the resources the joint action agency already owns. A project-based agency is very different, and that is what MPPA is. And the best way to say it really is a project-based means a member chooses to participate in the resources or services that best fit or complement their existing operation. And so we'd like to say that there's the benefits of independence while leveraging the expertise and the resource sharing economies of scale of participating with a large group of public power utilities through the Joint Action Agency. So just like you're discussing your Harbor Island project and other projects, those are decisions that are made inside the community, and the Joint Action Agency itself has nothing to do with that. So participating in the Joint Action Agency is really done one of two ways: through projects, and projects are really simply financial commitments to power supply and or delivery resources through contracts, or hard assets, investing in and constructing a energy resource. So ownership of electric generation or transmission or power purchase agreements are really the core foundation and functional requirement or a part of a project. We also have service committees, and they perform administrative or operational work to support the electric utility business. Typically, they're regulatory compliance activities and tasks, but there's also evaluation analysis. So if we're considering investing in a project, a service committee would oftentimes be formed first to do the exploratory research and analysis. Next slide. So this is a bit of a busy slide, and I apologize for that, but this just gives you an overview of the design of the agency with the projects on the left and the service committees on the right. And as you'll notice, just briefly reviewing those, some of the service committees, as I said, are explorative in nature. And as I discussed earlier, the projects are typically resources that are investments by the agency. Next slide. So this is a graphic of the projects and service committees that Grand Haven participates in. So you can see on the left there, there's 3 projects, the Energy Services Project being the most foundational and important to Grand Haven, because that provides not only power supply procurement activities, but all of the market interfacing that goes on to participate in wholesale markets, which is a complex day-to-day activity of buying and selling power and settling, scheduling, forecasting energy in wholesale markets. And the transmission project is a slice of transmission that is owned and or services that the agency provides, resources that Grand Haven themselves own and dedicated to MISO for revenue. And then the landfill gas project, which was done in the mid-2000s for the early stage renewables. On the right, you see a whole bunch of different service committees. Most of them provide exploratory activities, but 4 of the 9 are services that are provided through the committee. And again, those aren't limited only to MPPA members. We do have outside public power utilities that participate in MPPA service committees. Next slide. So the governance system of the agency is really based on separation of authority and checks and balances. So you have the Board of Commissioners, and each member has a board member or a commissioner, and it sits on the board. So we have 22 board members. We have project committees, which represent all of the member participants that are in that particular project. And then you have the general manager and CEO, which currently is myself. And resolutions are approved by a majority vote of the Board of Commissioners. And this structure between these 3 entities really provides a great forum for our board meetings, and it really allows a great discourse and decision making among and between entities that have different interests, but all of those for the long-term value proposition of the agency. Next slide. So the agency business model is pretty simple. I like to refer to it as it's the model chosen by members to access energy supply and services. So we don't go out and build power plants or invest in transmission hoping that our members will participate. We do what our members tell us to do. Now, we are staffed with experts in the power business who have lots of skills and capabilities, but we work for our members. We'll do analysis, make recommendations, but it's our members that ultimately are the voice that guide us to the decisions that we pursue. So we share energy resources and services. This offers lower costs, diversifies risk, and shares expertise. All of our members are municipal corporations, and were jointly created and democratically controlled. Next slide. So the economic principles that really are the key underpinning of the agency are economies of scale, resource diversity, resource sharing, lower funding costs, and knowledge and experience. And as I mentioned earlier, joint action agencies really in the 70s and 80s and even part of the 90s were really asset owning enterprises. And so you really were focused on those two, or really those three top, or actually really four blocks, was economies of scale and resource sharing and that financing entity. But what's really happened, particularly over the last 10 years after wholesale markets were created, is the specialization, the knowledge and experience has become a really huge part of our organization. The industry has gotten significantly more complex and the pace of change is accelerating. And you need folks. It's very difficult for a public power utility to afford and staff for all of the complexities that are going on in this business. And so we find that aspect of the agency, it's really a knowledge organization now, is driving a lot of the activities as opposed to making huge, large scale investments in resources. Next slide. So our primary business functions are energy resource management. So it doesn't matter if we own the resource or our members own the resource. The joint action agency is involved in managing those resources in the wholesale market. And our job is really simple. It's to reduce risk and enhance the revenue of those resources. Those are the two primary functions that we take on. Market operations are the activities that happen day in, day out, all day long. It's the scheduling and forecasting of power supply. It's the settlement activities that go on. It's all of the communications that go back and forth between the wholesale markets, which happen 24/7. Energy supply, of course, is the procurement and management of power supply. And then, unfortunately, compliance and energy services, or at least the compliance piece is probably unfortunate, as a growing part of our business. There's a lot of entities we have to comply with. We have to comply with regulations from the state of Michigan. We have to comply with regulations at the federal level. We have to comply with environmental regulations. So regulatory compliance is a big part of the agency services. Next slide. So the way I like to describe energy supply, it's really broken up into three buckets. There's market transactions, which are done inside of 5 years. These are pretty standardized and routine. The industry has really matured, and those agreements and the terminology that exists inside those are well understood by all market participants. When you enter into transactions that are contracted arrangements that are out longer than 5 years, they're typically customized. They're oftentimes driven by a resource. So most recently, you've heard MPPA doing large wind and solar power purchase agreements. And that's exactly what those are. They're driven by the resources that are being constructed, and those contracts are customized around those resources. And then there's asset investments. Those are typically 10 years or longer. They could be wholesale grid resources, which are connected to the transmission system, or they could be local community investments like you're talking about with Harbor Island. So MPPA's job really is to balance both contracted and owned assets to create the most value for members. And what we've seen really for the last 10 years or more is power prices have fallen and stayed really below asset investment values. And that's driven by all sorts of factors, but probably the most influential are the shale gas revolution, and then of course the onset of renewable mandates. Those two things happening together, along with very little load growth, and that was exacerbated in the 2009-2010 Great Recession, has really created a situation where energy prices have been very, very low for a lot of years. Next slide. So this is just a quick pictorial of energy resource management. Again, I mentioned earlier, we manage resources that both our members own and the agency owns, and those are done, through technology. And technology, like every industry that is operating in the United States, is undergoing tremendous change, and the electric utility industry is is undergoing significant change as well. And we are dealing with not only changes in the way we make electricity, but also how we deliver it. And so the energy resource management activity at MPPA has to stay on the cutting edge of those technologies. Next slide. So I mentioned compliance and energy services, and I don't need to go through all of these, but we're not regulated, rate regulated at the FERC level. We're not regulated by the State Public Service Commission, but there's a lot of activities that we have to comply with at this state. There's a capacity demonstration mandate that we have. So every for the 4 years forward, we have to demonstrate that we have enough capacity to meet the peak load of all of our members. We have an RPS, renewable portfolio standard, that we have to comply with. We have energy waste reduction that we have to comply with. Our members have to have voluntary green pricing programs. So those are all just state compliance mandates and all the programs that go along with that. We have NERC and FERC reliability, and of course, all of the financial compliance we have to operate under as well. So there's a lot of regulation, and we have to have staff that are capable and knowledgeable in those areas. Next slide. So David asked me to spend quite a bit of time here on the energy services project. So the next few slides are really focused on that. And that is where a large amount of the value that Grand Haven receives from MPPA is through the energy services project. So really, if you think about it, the energy services project is a full service energy management structure. And some of our members, like Holland, who have a lot of local generation, they're in the energy services project as well. They may take a lot less energy supply, which is one of those buckets you see on that on the pictorial there, but they take a lot of the energy risk management, market operations, reporting, and settlement activities. And so every member takes a different mix of those services. But at the core of the energy services project is a disciplined power supply portfolio plan, market operations services, risk management settlements, and then the concept of aggregation and diversification of power supply. That's really the foundation of how the energy services project is operated. Next slide.
Matt, if we can just stay on that side for just a minute and just open it up. I mean, I think Pat is right. This is kind of the core of MPPA and how it works. And, maybe if we get on these three slides and there's specific questions to them, maybe this is you have a problem with them interrupting or asking a question?
Not at all.
So, if there's any questions on these energy services slides, I think that, maybe before we move on to the next, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them.
Yeah, and I apologize if I was hustling along here, but I know that I just sort of felt like maybe we might have been behind schedule, so I was keeping the pace up. But I'm happy to slow it down as well. So if there's not any questions, I can go to the next slide. So let's just talk about the contract commitments and strategy. So in order for a member to be part of the energy services project, they have to execute an energy services agreement, which has a whole bunch of details and terms and conditions about the relationship between the agency and the member. They have to execute a risk management policy and a power supply hedge plan. They have to designate a member authorized representative. Those key foundational principles are what set in place how MPPA interacts with the member. The term of the energy services project is really effective through any settlement of any power purchase commitment. So if there was a contract that went out 5 years, the term of the relationship from the member is really through that 5-year period, and then there's a termination on 60 days notice after that. So the power supply procurement is really done over a 5-year time horizon, and integrates or wraps around member-owned resources and our long-term PPAs. And as I mentioned earlier, obviously previously Grand Haven produced most of their power through the Sims power plant, so they didn't have significant need for power supply from the agency. That's obviously changed now. And the power that is purchased is done through a risk-based procurement methodology. So it's really based on targeting a percent of price certain supply by year. So and we'll visualize that here in a slide later. And when we enter into transactions, we rarely ever execute transactions for a single member. We usually aggregate with other members for scale and diversity. Any questions? Okay, next slide. So to implement the risk management, the transaction execution, and the operational objectives of MPPA, we act as the transaction entity with energy suppliers. So our members don't transact with energy suppliers directly, although they're not prohibited from doing so. But MPPA is a transaction entity, and we are what is referred to as the market participant in the wholesale market. So in PGEM and MISO, that they see MPPA as a collection of its members. So under the structure, we take the title to the electricity, and we're the financial responsible entity to the energy marketplace. Any questions?
Pat, I'm going to interrupt again and just emphasize this. I mean, just to clarify, or just to restate what Pat just said, is MPPA is the market participant to the marketplace, or what people are calling the grid. All the transactions for MPPA are with all the transactions for Grand Haven are with MPPA, all right? So we don't transact any business with the grid, with any other operator. All of the transactions that are done on our behalf are between MPPA and a third party. And Grand Haven then has a contract with MPPA to buy the output of those transactions that we agreed to buy into. So it's just a lot of things are being said out there in the discussions, the public discussions that are being had about what Grand Haven is or isn't doing. When we buy into a solar contract, essentially MPPA is signing a contract on behalf of multiple members with that third party. MPPA actually is the counterparty to that contract, and Grand Haven is the counterparty to MPPA, and they have agreed to take a portion of every commitment that MPPA makes on our behalf. So just a clarification, again, I think it's just important to emphasize that because it does become really important to understand that relationship as we approve contracts and that sort of thing. Actually, in our past, we've actually have on record that Grand Haven actually approved a contract with a third-party counterparty, which never happened. So there's somewhat of a misconception historically on whether we buy or sell directly with a third party. We buy or sell only with one party, and that's MPPA.
Thanks, Dave. Next slide. So to ensure that the business model that I just described has effective legal and financial architecture under it, that really falls under the enabling legislation that I mentioned earlier in our discussion, Act 448, that provides the statutory authority to plan, develop, finance, and operate energy supply and delivery resources on behalf of its members. And of course, the contractual commitments that Dave was talking about with its municipal members, those legal requirements and covenants that are inside those agreements are what really bind the member and the agency to each other. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier that diversification is a key principle, and it's something that really is extremely difficult for any of our members to replicate on their own. Even our biggest member, which is the Lansing Board of Water and Light, has a pretty limited ability of diversifying its portfolio because just the sheer geography of the utility system itself, let alone the load that it serves. And so one of the key roles that the agency plays is the ability for our members to participate in lots of projects with small quantities. And what does that mean? Well, that means that you're diversifying your risk because power supply resources do not always operate the same. They don't operate the way they're expected. The economics sometimes can be different than expected. The operational capabilities can be different than expected. And so by diversifying those resources and those commitments, the member is reducing its risk. It also allows the member to build a portfolio of different types of resources, be it wind and solar, natural gas peaking, and pretty soon batteries. And so the ability to share those resources with other members is really a key principle of the Joint Action Agency. We also believe that competition brings on innovation, and every one of the procurements that we do is driven by a competitive business model. We want lots of different power supply resources to pursue interest in selling power to our members. And so whether it's short-term transactions we're doing, as I mentioned, from that 0 to 5 years, or long-term investment decisions, we run a competitive procurement model to ensure that we get lots and lots of interest from different types of resources and legal entities when we're choosing to procure power supply or invest in power supply resources for our members. Next slide. So this pictorial helps what I talked about with the that 5-year hedge plan. So we routinely procure in very small quantities, driving toward a larger percent of price certain supply as delivery term approaches. So in 2020, we target 85 to 90% of our members' power supply should be under a fixed price. And then as you can see visually from that graph, as you go further out in time, the percent of price certain fixed price certain supply drops. And that's by design. And again, typically that's wrapped around other long-term power purchase agreements or member-owned resources. So why do we do this? Well, it's really about rate stability and predictability. So it ensures utility won't have to experience large changes in power supply cost in any one year, up or down. I mean, power prices have historically been very, very volatile. Although, as I mentioned earlier, in the last, actually more than 10 years now, we've had sort of a declining and now levelized power supply portfolio. What we've seen fall, though, tremendously is renewables, and the price of renewables has continued to fall with competition and new technologies and tax subsidies as well. But we don't want to hit huge home runs and then have our members' rates go up the next year. We want them to have, and by the same token, we don't want to make large purchases in 1 year at higher prices and then have the rates fall dramatically the next year. So the best way to manage that is by having a very routine, predictable procurement methodology that gives our members that rate stability and predictability that they need to produce rates for their retail customers. Next slide.
Just a minute before we move on, Pat.
Sure.
Again, I'd probably have you elaborate a little bit more on this.
Sure.
The idea, the tall bar here would be next year, the smaller bar would be the following year after that, and so on. And that first high block that we go into a year that might be 80, 95% hedged, let's say, that's comprised of maybe 5 or more purchases made over the previous 4 years. The next block is maybe four purchases over the last 4 years. And so any one of those blocks that was purchased is very, very small. And the reason why most of these blocks are not coming to the board for approval is because they're so small, not small in comparison to dollars and cents, but as long as that block is somewhat consistent with our projected forward price curve that we've established, and that it falls within a small window in our energy risk management plan, it's less than $2 million, and it's less than 1 year in length duration, that particular purchase can occur without it going to the board. So we can, by buying very, very small pieces, we can actually get a portfolio built with very, very little risk because all of these pieces that we're buying are very, very small. And then under our current risk policy, the only contracts that have to come to the board are for those that are more than a year, or more than $2 million in total. So it does allow us to buy these very, very small pieces of the portfolio where MPPA is buying a much larger portion. because they're buying for others as well. So they're getting that economies of scale. But every piece that we buy is very, very small. So I think this is an important slide for everybody to kind of understand. Sorry for interrupting you, but I think it's important to kind of explain that.
That's a great point. And actually, I probably should have pointed out, and I think Dave touched on it, but that 2020, that's the year we're in now, those purchases really started in 2016, some in 17, 18, and 19, all for the year 2020. And so that was the point I was trying to make, is that we're continually, through a programmatic process, acquiring power supply in small quantities over many, many years. So by the time we get to 2020, it's made up of many years of purchases at various different times and in different quantities. Next slide. So in addition to obviously power procurement, we also do significant amounts of reporting, and our agency is actually under a new system that we've designed, and a new reporting system. And so our just like you're seeing in a lot of industries, we're trying to simplify what our members see, provide more visualizations and less words. But those detailed reports are all part of working with our members, their utility boards, their city councils, to provide those long-term budget forecasts and just really help them understand how their power supply procurement is being worked, what is composed of their power supply portfolio, what challenges and risks are there. And you will start seeing, as board members, more and more graphical reports from the agency here in the next year.
Pat,
Yeah.
what's the vertical axis on the left? What unit of measure?
Oh, those are megawatts.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Next slide. So, as you can imagine, making these decisions for our members requires a lot of analytics. And we have staff inside the agency that are highly skilled at doing data mining and data manipulation, being able to run scenario analysis. And we need to do that because we're really trying to find the gaps in our members' portfolios and align those with others so that when we make these transactions, that it fits. And it's easy if their portfolio is static, but it isn't. You know, loads are growing, loads are declining. Think of this year alone. I mean, COVID was a dramatic experience for us. And your utility, frankly, was one of the utilities in March and April that saw pretty significant declines in load, up to 20%. And so we have to continually be monitoring and analyzing our members' loads. We also have to be working with them as they plan to do different types of activities behind their own meter. And your case is a classic example of that, where you're pondering making an investment, whether you make it or not, or the size of that prevents us from executing that. So we have to incorporate that into our analytics. And so we do a lot of scenario analysis, ultimately to come up with recommendations. And then we sit down with the executive staff of the member and make our recommendations and then execute on those transactions. In addition to that analysis, and we have to consider compliance with state and federal liability requirements, agency retirements of its own resources, renewable strategies. So there's a lot of activity that goes into this. I know that's resource adequacy is a big issue in our state right now with the retirement of a lot of the baseload resources. So we're spending a lot of time on those types of issues, maybe more than we have in the past.
Pat,
yeah,
just
sure.
Here again, maybe you can do a better job than I can, and I can ask you a question that I get quite regularly.
Sure.
Is, when the agency is comparing, particularly multiple projects to fill different areas, so often we hear like a solar project is just so many dollars per kilowatt hour, and another project is so many dollars per kilowatt hour. Why wouldn't you just go from select A to B? You're doing all these great analysts. Why don't you just throw them on the table and compare one to the other based on the overall price and pick the one that's lowest cost and go buy it all? You're telling us here it's a real sophisticated analysis. We got to do all these different things. What would you say to the person that just says, "Well, it's really easy. Just throw it on the table and compare the two, and that's all you need to look at."
Sure.
What are you talking about with these sophisticated analysis, and what are you looking at?
Sure. Well, probably the simplest way to describe it is every power supply resource produces electricity differently. So you can't really just say, one costs $40 a megawatt hour and the other one costs 38. So procure or invest in the resource that is producing electricity at $38, because that resource may be generating all of its electricity during off-peak hours or seasonally off-peak. Or that resource has very little reliability benefits. So now the agency has to go out and purchase a whole bunch of additional, what we call capacity or other resources to make up for the reliability that one resource wasn't able to provide. And that's exactly what some of the incredible complications we're dealing with now. I mean, the industry, for a lot of good reasons, is moving toward a decarbonization model. And the two principal resources that are feeding the power supply are wind and solar. And both of them have their own challenges, but they both have the same challenge in that they're intermittent. They're completely dependent on weather. And intermittent resources obviously have to be backed up because electricity needs to be reliable every minute, every second of every day. And so as we move to more and more variable energy resources, which is what we describe these renewable resources, we need to find new ways, particularly if fossil fuel is going to be used less and less, to support that. And so it's on both sides of the ledger. It's at the demand side and the power supply side. And batteries are something that we're investigating, but they're not quite ready for prime time, although I suspect in the next few years we will be doing battery projects. And in the meantime, we've got to come up with other solutions for providing reliability. So it's a pretty complicated process, and it's really because of the profile of how a particular resource makes electricity. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but.
Yeah, and I think this scenario analysis that you're talking about as well, doesn't that assume a diverse supply with differing resources filling different pieces of the mix? And then you get these complex analyses that you're talking about with multiple different resources combining together for the best fit, giving a whole lot of different scenarios. So again, this is not a type of analysis that your local utility can just do and throw them. I mean, or we can do at a public meeting and just sit around and talk about the pros and cons. This is something that requires some pretty sophisticated heft. I've seen some of these analysis, and they're tough to explain to people. I think you did as good a job as I can do, but I think that's the problem that we have here is sometimes understanding the complex analysis that you're doing at MPPA on our behalf and making these recommendations and then simplifying it into a 2-minute sound bite that we can approve at a board meeting. And just understand our challenges. I think that's what we're talking. We talk a lot about that, and these sophisticated analysis that sometimes don't even print out very well because they're models, they're spreadsheets after spreadsheets, and oftentimes not easy to present. And I think that's what you're getting at here is one of the strengths of MPPA is their ability to do this on our behalf. So anyway,
I think one of the strengths that you're going to see from MPPA in the future is going to solve the concerns you just raised. I mean, we've invested pretty significantly in business intelligence resources and people that are capable of generating reports from that, because there's a lot of great information, but Dave's right. I mean, if it's presented in complex spreadsheets, it's difficult for anyone to get any kind of meaning out of it. And when we're dealing with small members who don't even have a utility board like Grand Haven does, they have a city council only, they don't have any expertise in the power business. We really need to present them information just like it was in high school or even middle school so that they can understand what we're doing. And the way we're spending more of our time now on that is to use a lot more graphics and less numbers and help people understand, it doesn't need to be complicated what they see. The complication can be done behind the scenes. And all the great companies are doing that now, and the agency is really focused on that big time, and you'll see more and more of that from us in 21. Next slide. So we also do long-term planning. So we provide 15-year load forecast to the RTO. And obviously short-term, we provide multi-year and annual load forecasts. We work with our members like Dave so they can tell us what's going on in their community, what they expect for load growth on the commercial, residential, and industrial side. And all that information helps us build better algorithms, better models so that we can make better decisions long-term. So if we're going to go out and buy power for 5 or 10 years from now, we better have a high probability that power can serve that load. And so building the profile of that load and also understanding how large it is and what changes may impact it in the long-term future is incredibly important. And then, of course, on the short term, we do daily load forecasting. We work with Dave's staff there too. If a a customer is going to shut down or there's a weather situation that comes in, we have got to make those changes as well day to day. Next slide. So this is a pictorial of how Grand Haven sort of compares to our average MISO and our average PJM member for energy and capacity. And Dave wanted me to put this together so that you could visualize the percent of your portfolio that's under contracted arrangements by periods of time. So the way this is broken out is 0 through 5 years, 6 through 10, 11 through 15, and then 16 years or longer. And obviously I could break this down even in more detail by year, but this just helps you look at these 5-year blocks of time and what percent of your portfolio is contracted. So for energy, as an example, and that 0 for 5 years, 50% on average of your portfolio is under contracted a fixed price arrangement, just under 20% in that 6 to 10 year time horizon, about 16% in that 11 through 15, and 13% thereafter. And you might ask, well, what are those resources that are way out there 16 years? And those are wind and solar PPAs that Grand Haven has entered into in the last few years, and which is really comprising that period of time. So most of that's renewable energy out 16 years and longer. If you look at our average MISO member, not surprisingly, it's a little bit higher, and that makes sense because our average member didn't have a power plant like Sims that was providing almost all of their power supply. So Grand Haven's playing a little bit of catch up there. And it's probably even more noticeable when you get out into that 6 to 10 year time horizon, which is about 50% and 40% in that.
Can I just interrupt you for just a minute? Because I think it's important to realize what Pat's describing here when he says MISO average, and I just want to be clear on
MISO member average is what I meant to say.
MPPA has members in MISO.
Yeah, sorry.
They have members in PJM. So those averages are municipal utilities, members of MPPA.
Yeah, sorry.
That are in either MISO or PJM. They have nothing to do with the average utility in PJM or including Consumers Detroit and all those other people. We're only looking at the members of MPPA, and what he's essentially saying, if I can paraphrase and correct me if I'm wrong, that Grand Haven is not hedged or has a lot of open positions out quite a ways, more than the average utility at MPPA. In other words, we obviously just shut down a power plant, and we haven't made a lot of long-term commitments yet to fill that hole, where other utilities at MPPA have assets that may be out for some resources that they've purchased into in the past that are longer lived and have a higher fixed cost, essentially, or a fixed rate for over the next several years. And we have a lot more variability built into our portfolio, and that's what MPPA will be helping us fill, right?
Yep. The good news is, and I'm sure some of those MISO members that have larger percentages of their portfolio hedge, some of those are from resources that were, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 years ago. And as I mentioned earlier, power prices have declined dramatically during this time. So Grand Haven's actually in a great position. They really are. I mean, from a market perspective, the opportunities that Grand Haven has in front of them is really wonderful, because the power prices are significantly lower than they've been in previous decades. So not a bad spot to be in. Now, obviously, you're more susceptible to volatility in future rates, because less of your power supply is under fixed price contracted arrangements. But that's a good news story. And, we're working with Dave and his team to slowly and pragmatically fill that. It also provides the Grand Haven a great opportunity to add more renewables. And some of our members don't have that luxury, because they have such a significant amount of their portfolio hedged in some older resources that they have a less ability to do that. The good news go ahead, Dave.
Question. Why would you contract out 12, 14, 15 years or further? Doesn't that create a real risk in terms of what may happen in terms of market and the development of technology? I mean, wouldn't you easily get stuck with something that is more expensive than what's available as you get closer?
Well, the knife cuts both ways,
that?
John. So that comes back to the discussion that we've had pretty much, I think, through a couple slides here. It's all about diversification and laddering in power supply. So you're exactly right. We would never recommend that our members go out and hedge large portions of their supply under long-term arrangements. That wouldn't make sense for some of the reasons you're stating. Conversely, however, we don't know what the future will be. There could be all sorts of things that could change in the future that could actually cause power prices to go higher, or capacity prices to go higher, or energy prices to go higher. So the best strategy, after we've noodled over this endlessly, is to really be diversified and can be continually rolling into and out of agreements. And so we've designed our portfolio strategy to exactly be able to participate in technology changes as they come, and not be ever too wedded to any one resource or too wedded to any one vintage year. And it's actually a real challenge right now, because some of our members that have 100% renewable resolutions that their cities have passed, their natural inclination is they want to get there early. Well, the problem with that, of course, is that they may make all those decisions in the years 2018, 19, and 20, and those decisions will be around for 20 years. So what happens in 2028? They won't have any ability to participate in the technology at that time. So we have a lot of challenges there to continually try to remind our members to stay the course, use risk management, and layer in transactions over time.
So how far back did MPPA start? You're founded in 1978.
Yep.
It seems like one of the things that would help to know the answer to my question would be how accurate your projections have been out beyond 10 years. Do you track that?
When you say projections, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, if you're trying to recommend what to buy between 11 and 15 years or 16 years and greater, it's got to be based on something. It's got to be based on your estimate of investments that have the least amount of risk. So how do you track your record in terms of how good you are at projecting that?
We don't try to predict anything. We have a forward curve, so we know exactly what the energy prices are for the next 15 years that we could go out and transact at. And for the reasons you're stating, we damn well know we're not great at predicting what power prices are going to do. And that's exactly the reason that we have portfolios, so that we are continuously adding and subtracting resources, because if I knew exactly what power prices would be in 10 years, I wouldn't be here giving a presentation to you today. And that is exactly why you have a diversified portfolio, because there's nobody on this call, nobody in this room, and there's nobody in this country that can tell you what power prices are going to be 15 years from now. So we don't try to do that.
John, I think what's important to realize is what Pat said earlier is these longer term contracts that you see those are not just routine power purchases. Those are purchases tied to an asset. So all of those purchases are purchases tied to an asset, a renewable contract, which is the same thing is what you're essentially saying is that when we want to sign a local contract with a wind developer or a solar developer, those are firm contracts for the purchase from that asset for a long period of time. Now, what we're saying is blend some of those long-term purchases from specific assets with shorter-term purchases from the market. But what you're seeing out past 5 years is there's no just generic market purchases in that. Those are purchases from specific assets that we have signed a longer term, which is a known quantity. There's no uncertainty there. That's what Pat's saying is those contracts are all for a fixed quantity, particularly if it's from a solar contract. That contract with that solar developer, it's not like a contract that we had for coal. That's a fixed price contract for the life of the contract at a fixed price that's known. There's no uncertainty there.
So the real risk is whether or not technology will overtake that particular method of generation and provide something at a cheaper price. That's the risk.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
You're right, John. Absolutely.
Because I was going to say, you've got MISO average, you got 40% invested starting at 11 years.
Yeah. Well,
that's a good share of your portfolio.
Yeah. It's interesting, John, most of that's actually from investments, shockingly, that were done back in 1980. When I was in,
happy with it?
When I was in grade school.
Are they happy with
Were we happy with ours?
Well, those resources.
The reason I ask is because I know we have at least one investment that the BLP made a while back that really ends we're sorry we did it.
Yeah.
Because of what's happened.
The best way to not be really sorry is don't ever do a large transaction, because they'll all be wrong at some point, and the best way to avoid it ever being a real problem is to make sure it's small. And I think that's really the point that I'm trying to make.
Yeah. I think John's bringing up there that part of that 16%, let's say in the 10 to 15 range, we currently have, as you pointed out earlier, our landfill gas contracts are 8% of that. Probably they're going to start coming off in 2025 or so, but it's 8% of that 6 to 10 year number probably.
John, that's the best example of all. So back in 2008, everybody was clamoring for, that's when then Governor Granholm passed the Public Act 286 and the 10% renewable requirement was enacted. And there was like a scramble for people to go out, and wind deals back then were being done for $120 a megawatt hour. Today they're 30. People, in this case, the landfill gas projects were $80 and $90 a megawatt hour, escalating at 2% a year. And they're completely out of favor now. The only saving grace for the agency, even though it did do those landfill gas transactions, is on a relative basis, they are very small to our whole portfolio. And the good news is that they are rolling off and starting significantly in 2026. And so, and they'll be decaying thereafter. But you're exactly right. I mean, if you're going to make long-term decisions, make sure they're not giant portions of your portfolio. So the table below is just capacity. So I think you all understand the difference, or maybe you don't, but the difference between capacity and energy. Capacity is the peak amount of capability of a plant, and Grand Haven in this case has more capacity than that it has energy as a percentage of its portfolio, and those 0 to 5 year time frame. But then that obviously decays over time too, and down into that 20% level. So pretty similar to our PJM members, really. I would say probably more representative there. And I know that's an issue that you've been debating inside your community in terms of what your capacity portfolio looks like. But this just gives you a sense of sort of how it looks. And by the way, just remember that the reason why that number is so high for the 0 to 5 years is we're obligated under the law, State of Michigan Public Act 341. We have to show 4 years out that we have 95% of our peak demand contracted. So that's why that number is so high. Any questions here, or go off to the next slide? So we're wrapping up now, guys. So I know you're ready, itching to get moving here, but what are the forces that are shaping the future? I just wanted to talk about these real quick, and you already know all of them, but the eco-conscious culture, obviously the end-use customers wanting more and more sustainable resources, distributed energy resources, flat load. We're not seeing a lot of load growth, renewable energy, natural gas supply, intelligent technology, and then what we call a customer-centric framework. I mean, we really at the Joint Action Agency are working hard with our members because it's their customers that are becoming much more involved in the energy business than they ever have in the past, and we expect that to continue going forward. Next slide. So in the state of the state here in Michigan is, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we have declining reserve margins, a lot less controllable resources. Renewables and energy efficiency are growing, and decentralization, a lot of smaller resources now through what we call DER. So energy investment is being driven here, legislative and regulatory solutions, and of course, customer requirements. And what does all this mean? It really means collaboration among and between public power utilities is really critical to tackle these challenges. And it's not just us. I mean, the investor-owned utilities are struggling with this too, and will be for the next few years as we sort of manage our way through this this new paradigm that we're in. And the final slide here is just really a wrap up and joint action and public power. You know, if you go across the United States, the vast majority of public power utilities are part of some form of power supply consortium, a joint action agency. And, you know, we're really working together to find ways to share resources, and probably more than ever now, share technology and knowledge so that we can compete and succeed in this business, which is becoming incredibly complex. So with that, I'm done. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any. And of course, you can, I'll have Dave circulate my contact information, and feel free to call. I've got a great staff at MPPA, and a lot of them are smarter than I am at many of the things we talked about here today. So,
Pat, I have a question. We are closing in on 25% renewable in our portfolio. Where does that place us with the other 21 utilities?
Good question. I think on average, our members are around 20%-ish, in low 20s. You know, we do have members like Traverse City and Petoskey that are shooting for 40% renewable here in the next couple of years. And they actually have a 100% renewable objective, you know, out in the distant future here, 2035 and 2040. So you're about average. I would say our average is probably around 22%.
For the, Pat,
and by the way, that's changing all the time. You know, a lot of times it's the local customers that are driving that. Sorry to interrupt you.
let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Is your compensation for brokering capacity deals for companies like Grand Haven Board of Light and Power, is that covered in the membership fee, or is there an additional charge for whatever work is done to do that?
Yeah. So members of the agency pay annual dues to the agency, and then they are also responsible for agency overhead. And that's allocated to the members based on a series of accounting agreements that were put in place many, many years ago.
Well, is the overhead tied to how much work you do for a specific company during the year?
Yes, it is.
So there is a price for having you act as the broker.
Well, we're not a broker. We're owned by you.
I'm using the wrong term, but I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, the way it works is that Grand Haven is part of the energy services project, so it shares the cost of all of the staff and support and systems that are part of the energy services project. That's where the principal overhead comes from, John. And then it's allocated to Grand Haven from that structure. So you share the cost, of course, of people and systems and processes. So if we're doing extra work for Grand Haven, it's not, excuse me?
What determines what percentage is paid by us?
Pat, if I could just,
Sure.
I think what he's getting at is MPPA is not a commission-based agency. They do not earn a certain percentage of the sale. They just recover their costs of essentially the personnel costs and the time spent in analyzing a particular project or a particular purchase, and then the cost associated that they do that is allocated based on the proportionate share of Grand Haven's purchase as compared to someone else. So if MPPA is going out and buying 100 megawatts of capacity and there's 5 hours of time associated with that, it has nothing to do with the amount that we pay, who we buy it from. It just, the overhead is only an allocation of the time spent by MPPA in completing that transaction. And then that transactional cost is shared back with the members based on their participation in that particular transaction.
So there is a cost tied to what the work that's done for us. I'm not suggesting that the MPPA gets a percentage of whatever is paid. I'm just trying to figure out how they're compensated. I think you've answered my question.
All of MPPA's costs are recovered from members.
What's that?
All of MPPA's costs are recovered from the member with no profit. It's just their costs are recovered, and they're allocated based on the time spent with the various utilities and other allocation factors that are set up within the agency.
Okay. Pat, another question. What is the current average cost per megawatt for market purchasing of capacity right now? What's the average?
So are you, okay. That question has a lot of layers to it. So there's the energy cost, there's capacity cost, and then there's term, right? So power supply cost for say 2021 is energy's around $32 a megawatt hour. Capacity is about $5 a kilowatt month. But then if you go out longer term, say 10 years, the power supply energy costs are higher because it's taken in some inflation and higher natural gas costs and other things. It's probably in the mid 30s for energy, and capacity costs are actually a bit lower, probably in that $4.50 per kilowatt month area. And John, electricity is I think is the most volatile commodity there is. And so a lot of little things can impact it. The amount of renewables, people passed laws to increase renewables, natural gas prices, load, weather. So there's a lot of volatility in pricing, but I hope that helps.
Just looking at the average, Pat. I'm not asking you about a specific situation.
Yep. Okay.
You don't keep that,
Did that answer your question?
One more question. What do you think the future of natural gas is as a fuel for the next 30 years? And do you think there would be a future carbon tax on it?
If I had to guess, there will be a carbon tax someday. And maybe that someday is coming sooner than later. I mean, certainly societally, it sort of feels like we're heading in that direction. there's a lot of politics around that, and it's very, very complicated, and how that would happen is going to require a hell of a lot of time and effort to put forth. But, definitely societally, that seems like the direction we're heading. As far as natural gas, I mean, it is a really, really important fuel. I mean, we heat our homes with it. And I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. Will there be less use of it in the future for power generation? Certainly, that seems to be the direction we're heading. But until we figure out a way to heat our homes and heat our buildings a different way, I think natural gas is going to be around for quite a long time. 30 years from now is a long time. I mean, there's a lot of talk about hydrogen, John, that through electrolysis and other ideas there that are pretty exciting. And so I suspect technology will win the day there, and we'll morph into a different kind of blend. But I think natural gas, even if it's a feedstock to hydrogen, is going to be around for a long time. Those are just my personal opinions, not those of the agency.
Is the
Yeah,
agency's
the
opinion
the hydrogen question is a big one that we haven't really talked about at all here locally, but a lot of people are talking about hydrogen being blended with natural gas to lower the carbon rates and burned in a natural gas fired recip or
It's very, very expensive right now. It doesn't make economic sense at the moment, but there's a lot of interest in it, and there'll definitely be a lot of projects you'll see, maybe not the way Dave's describing it, but on a much larger scale. And so, you'll be reading a lot about hydrogen, both green and blue, they call it now, over the next few years for sure.
Pat, this was very informative. Thank you very much for taking the time to meet with us.
Can I,
Okay. Thank you.
maybe just, I know we have some council members on and we don't get Pat here that much. So, I mean, if we could just, Pat, keep you here for just a minute. And if there's
Sure.
any council members on, I guess I'd like to give them an opportunity because, I know they sit in on some of these things and they have questions for me, and sometimes it's better for them to ask you directly. I don't know if any council members have a question, but if you raise your hand, and we'd like to give you an opportunity to ask a question of MPPA since they're here and they don't come that often.
And you're welcome to call me too at the office, and I'll be happy to talk to you.
All right, I just want to make the offer. It doesn't sound like we got any takers, so thank you a lot, Pat. We really appreciate you coming and spending time with us today.
Great. Well, thank you guys. Enjoy.
All right.
Bye.
If we could put up the little bar chart that I have later on in the presentation, we can talk about the next item. Again, I just got a couple quick items here to discuss, just some information kind of in response to some of the things that we're hearing in the public. I just provided you this sheet. First of all, there was a comment editorial written in the paper that, first of all, MPPA was saving, I don't know, somewhere, I think the number was thrown out $1 million a month on our power supply. It's highly exaggerated. It looks like this year we'll probably save, and I think the board knows this, but we'll probably save somewhere on the order of $1.5 million in total power supply cost savings this year over last. So what I've done here in this chart, and this kind of shows, is what are we doing with all the money? All right. I mean, why aren't we lowering rates? So what I tried to do here is try to explain kind of our strategy over the next several years. So if you look at our last 5 years, and actually our costs have been and our revenue requirement has been very, very stable over the last 4 fiscal years. All right. So this first column, I've just gone back, pulled these general numbers out of our annual reports. This is not sophisticated analysis here. This is just looking at these particular categories of costs and then totaling them up And that number down at the bottom, the reason I did this is that revenue requirement is the same revenue requirement that was reported in that average sheet that we talked about. So if you look at the average revenue requirement, obviously dollars per kilowatt for the last 4 years is $126.40 per megawatt hour, or 12.64 cents per kilowatt hour. And the difference here between that number and the number that I reported to you earlier in comparison to other utilities was this number includes street lighting. So when we sell street lighting on a dollars per kilowatt hour basis, that's a very high cost service because we're recovering the cost of the lamp, the bulb replacement, the maintenance, all that other kind of stuff. So if we include that, we don't make a lot of money on street lighting, but if we include that average cost per kilowatt of that service, which is a very high cost service, in those dollars per kilowatt hour, it bumps the average up a little bit from 12.5 cents to 12.6 some cents. Does that make sense? So that bar chart on the bottom says, okay, we bring in on average about 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour, or $126 a megawatt hour. And where does that money get spent? We take the revenue in. Where does that money get spent? And the general categories are that we've utilized here is power supply, and that power supply cost has historically included our system operations costs. So what I've tried to do is gone back and broke out our system operation costs. But if you look at our power supply costs for the last 4 years, it's the $57.15 plus the $9.50. All right. So that operational cost, we're operators at the power plant, and we charge those operators to the power supply costs. So our total costs of power supply per kilowatt recovered in our rates was, if I do the math right here, $66.65. Does that make sense? Now this year, we're having to pay for operators from the revenue requirement, but we aren't submitting those dollars to MPPA. So when we only look at our power supply costs from MPPA, there's huge savings there. People are saying, why can't we pass all those cost savings back to the customer? Well, the problem is we still have operators that we need to pay for. So that $9.50 is going down, and we have every intention to lower that next year and the year after and the year after. As those operators retire, we aren't going to fill those spots. So we know that the operational costs to operate our system are going to go down. All right. So in this chart, I have estimated, and these are no way NATS numbers that the cost of service study will probably not replicate these numbers because they do it a whole lot more sophisticated than what I've done here. But what I've tried to show is where are those dollars that we're collecting? If we don't give them back to the customer, where are they going? So you can see, and again, back to this 4-year average is we had power supply costs, we had operational costs, then we had distribution and engineering costs. And as we've said, is as we reinvest some of those savings that we've had in distribution, our distribution costs per kilowatt hour are going to go up as we employ and we grunch more apprentice linemen through the program. We have a blip here where we're going to have higher distribution costs, at least this year and maybe next, as we pay for this transitional cost to go from and we re-emphasize some of the dollars in distribution. And then we have administrative and general costs. There's a couple things that are going to be coming out of there in the next few years. One of them may be an ending of our energy efficiency program that is not required of us after the end of next year. That's $400,000. If we don't re-up that, we don't have to collect that from our customers, and we can pass that savings back to our customers in lower charges. So those are the types of things. What I've tried to do is look out and said, okay, what we've told customers is that our revenue requirement is going to stay relatively constant, even though we are dropping the cost from MPPA. Now, you can see that that cost from MPPA is going up at a relatively fast pace in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And if you look at that, it's about $4 in 1 year. That's about, that's a pretty stiff increase. And why is that happening? That's happening because primarily of the forward price curves for purchased capacity is going up. So when I've calculated this, again, if we go to the market today and buy that capacity, we know what that cost is. That's the cost I've used. Now, if we wait a year and we buy it next year and we don't lock it in, obviously that cost is going to be different than what I assumed here. So what I've tried to do is just break up these categories, but what you can see with the top or the bottom $85 a megawatt hour or so over the last 4 years has been to pay for expenses of our operation. All right. So if you take that $87.10 that's up on the top, that's our operating expenses. So our operating revenues paid for operating expenses, and then they had a quote operating income before depreciation. Depreciation is a non-cash expense. So I have not expensed depreciation. So in essence, all of the operating income goes into the bank for capital improvements, future costs. And then we take 5% of that total. So 5% of that $12.06 goes back to the city in a payment in lieu of tax, the contribution. All right. So if we look at that $26.40 over the last 4 years, $6.28 of that we took in and we just gave to the city. All right. That based on that 5% calculation. And so if our costs go up, the contribution to the city goes up. That's proportional to the 5%. So that number is always 5% of the total, right? And then the big green block there, that's profit, not profit. It's operating income, better term for it. That's the difference between our operating expenses and our operating revenues. Now, what do we do with that? Well, what isn't in those operating expenses is those demolition costs, those remediation costs, those pension adjustment costs that we've paid. None of those costs are in our normal operating costs. So all of those costs, plus the capital costs that you're investing in the system, have to come out of that green block there. All right. So we have been, for the most part, saving a good portion of that $33.12 in the bank so that we can go into this kind of aggressive investment period that we're talking about. But you can see that this year, that number's going up because our expenses are down and our charges are going to be the same. So on a cost per kW or per megawatt, yep, there's a little bit more green in there. We are saving a little bit more money. Now, question is that doesn't include the amount of money that we're taking out of there to pay for these increased costs that we have, i.e. demolition and site remediation. So if we included those costs in that green block would be a lot smaller, particularly if we tried to recover it all in 1 year. So what we're trying to do is we're saying, okay, we're not going to take that money, that demolition cost, that site remediation cost, some of those capital costs, and we're going to spread them out over the next 20 years. And again, this is a little different than what we've said. I talked to John yesterday a little bit. John was using the term 30 years. We are looking at a 20-year financing at this point in time. A 20-year financing, not a 30-year financing. Because when we published the notice of intent, we said it would be up to a 35-year duration for up to $75 million. Well, we're not going to issue $75 million of debt. We're only going to issue at this point in time, an estimate is closer to $45 million. So by lowering the amount that we're bonding, I think our finance people would suggest don't go out so far, because you have a pretty good debt service coverage ratio. And that yellow number in that bar chart is start paying off debt service. So when you hear me talk about debt service coverage ratio, what we're looking at is that green block and yellow block in comparison to the yellow block. So what that means is if we're bringing in an operating income of a certain amount, what the rating agencies are going to want to see is that comparison with how much of your free money are you spending to pay off debt. It's kind of like that calculation that people do for your mortgage. They say, how much of your income are you using to pay off your mortgage? And they're only going to let you spend 20% of that. In the mortgage markets, they call that a debt service coverage ratio. And we have a very, very healthy debt service coverage ratio in these comparisons at almost 3. In other words, the yellow block is a third of the yellow and green block. So we're using about a third with a 20-year financing at $47 million at 4%. We're still only using a third of our, quote, operating income to pay off debt. Now, when that number gets bigger, typically what you do, you either extend the term out or you borrow less. So by borrowing less, we're able to shorten the term that we're making these obligations to. And I think that's what we would do going forward. But until we determine the amount of debt that we're going to issue, that debt service coverage ratio is in flux. All right. So what I've tried to do, though, is just show you how we can finance $45 million of, or more. We could actually do the same comparison for $75 million at 35 years, which is in the notice of intent. And that yellow block isn't going to change that much. And we will be able to finance a very, very healthy, very, very healthy payment for a mortgage. Without a rate increase. So this idea that we're going to borrow money and it's going to cause us to raise our rates is not what we're assuming. We are not assuming any rate increase to pay for that debt service component. What we would be doing is essentially financing things like demolition, like site remediation, like project costs that would otherwise consume more than a year of that green payment. We wouldn't even have enough. If we tried to expense all of our demolition costs and all of our site remediation costs, that green block wouldn't be enough, and we would have to take cash out of the bank, all right? So that's why we're borrowing that money, so that we can keep our costs the same, and we have no intention, regardless of whatever we do, the driving factor is going to be no rate increases. So anybody that's suggesting that we are raising our rates to do any project has not been listening to our financing for the last 3 years. We have never suggested any rate increases are needed to fund a very, very large borrowing. And that's simply because of the fact that our operating income is very strong right now. And it's based on the fact that we we've been in the process of lowering our expenses in a time frame where we've held our rates constant, and that money is now growing. Now, when we start spending it again in a healthy capital plan, that money isn't going to be available to lower costs, all right? We've never suggested that we're going to use the lowering of expenses because we have a healthy demand for those resources to pay off things that we have not done for a very, very long time. So regardless of whether we build, we have distribution capital projects. We have over $80 million in our 5-year capital improvement plan, and only, I think right now, 22 million, which is going down, is in generation. All right. So if we want to spend a lot more in generation than 17 million, that will drive our rate costs up. We are not planning on those types of things. So again, just a pictorial. If it doesn't help, throw it away. But it's a pictorial of our financing plan to finance this debt service component that we're currently looking at with no rate increases, none.
Dave?
Yes.
Hey. What next is sales volume, third line up from the bottom. What is that in parentheses? What does that say? What does it mean?
Including street lighting.
And what is this unit of measure for sale volume? What is it? Dollars or what?
That's sales volume in megawatt hours. Essentially
it's in megawatt hours.
Right.
Okay, and the power supply.
That's why the cost above it is dollars.
What did you use for capacity per megawatt hour? What'd you use?
I used our actual average transaction volume.
What is it?
Well, it changes. There's different blocks at different times.
Give me the average. What'd you use for these numbers?
They're different every year based on the purchases that we've made and then the forward price projections. But
okay, what were they for?
Let me finish my answer if I can. Jesus. Out in 2023, I used the same $5 per kW month that Pat gave you earlier in his presentation, because that's about where the forward price curve is for current purchases. Now, we've actually purchased below that level. If you remember, a few years ago, we bought 10 megawatt, or we probably should have bought more. I mean, you can say, well, geez, why didn't you buy it at $3 when it was available at $3? We didn't. We only bought 10 megawatts because that's all people wanted to. We wanted to bring in differing costs. So we did buy capacity for $3 a kW month. And everybody said, wow, that's the cost it's going to be forever. Right now, it's about $5 a kW month.
You used $5 for 2023. Did you use $5 for 2022?
No, I used the $5 for when we have to go out for 2022. And I used the actual purchases that we've made. And if you remember, go back to what Pat just said. We have 80%, 90% of our capacity purchased for next year. We know the cost. We have 70% of the capacity purchases for the following year, 50% for the next year, 40% for the next year. So we use the dollars that we've actually transacted at for the volumes that we've transacted at. And then we have to assume a market price for the rest. And what I used was the MPPA forward price curve.
Is the dollars that you're showing for what we haven't bought yet, Dave, under power supply?
Yes.
Okay. So if it's for what we haven't bought yet, then did you use $5 a kilowatt month for it or what?
Or capacity. Again, you're not going to get these are first of all in dollars per megawatt hour. Capacity is sold in dollars per kW month. All right. So what we've done is taken the capacity costs for a given year, the total, and divided by the megawatt hours that we have had So you have a blended power supply cost for all of the necessary capacity, all of the necessary transmission, all of the necessary renewable energy credits, all of the necessary kilowatt hours in that blended rate that I've determined. Now, how good is that of an estimate? It's only as good as the hedge that you have for what proportion you have. So that's what Pat was showing you, is we have gone out. Next year's numbers are very, very accurate, all right? Because they're almost all already hedged. When you go out the next year, there's more uncertainty. There is some purchases out there, and then there's uncertainty. Where there's uncertainty, I have utilized what MPPA is saying the cost is today. However, we're not going to the market today and buying much, all right? So they've developed a forward price curve. We are going to the market and buying on a regular basis, and we're building that portfolio for the next year. But what I'm trying to do here is saying we feel very comfortable that we will be able to buy going forward, given the current price estimates, without raising our rates. That's really all I'm saying here. And that is showing some reductions this year and some growth in the next several years, primarily in capacity purchase increases. So are we going to save the $1.5 million that we saved this year, next year? No, we're not. Because we already know what the majority of our costs are going to be the following year, because we've already purchased them. And we kind of know that the market is going away from us, all right? So it's getting more expensive. So if we wait a year, wait another year, we're buying a little bit more, where are the costs going to be? You want guarantees? Go buy it now. If you want to assume that it's going to go up, buy a little bit now and maybe a little bit later because you're not sure of it. But that's what MPPA does on a regular basis. And what they recommend is a somewhat dollar cost averaging strategy. Buy some every year, 5 years before, 4 years before, 3 years before, 2 years before, in smaller blocks, blend them in, and they can then produce, and this is, I think it was a good lead in to the reports that you'll start seeing, is you will start seeing much more sophisticated quarterly reports from MPPA than you have previously received that will give you their estimates of where these things are. Now you can shake your head and you can say how sophisticated this is.
No, let's quit talking about it.
This is how we're going to do business.
Tried to answer my question.
So again, it's just, this pictorial was not to say these are where our costs are going to be, but it's a pictorial to say, in response to the people that are saying our rates should go down, our rates should do this, our rates should do that, our rates will change next year when we do a cost of service study. But the revenue requirement in total is not anticipated to change so much next year. Now, we might reallocate a little bit. We might change from industrial to commercial. We might move dollars around, but that total 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour or $125 a megawatt hour is not going to change much. And we anticipate living within our budget. And our budget is no rate increases through this transition. That's our budget. That's what we told everybody. And nothing that we have, when we encounter something that would change that, i.e. a $100 million project, what did we do? We didn't do the project. So we'll live by what we've said. We're entirely living within our realm. We are not pushing, we're actually reducing the amount of spending so that we can remain within the promises that we have made. Next slide. Again, this is another presentation, John, when you want to go to capacity estimates going forward. This is a chart that we have received that I just thought it was important for Because when we're talking about buying capacity, what is capacity dependent on? It's entirely dependent on the supply. So we are taking, based on this chart right here, between now and 2030, 5.5 gigawatts, that's 1,000 megawatts. So 5,450 megawatts of capacity out of the marketplace in the next 10 years. What do you think will happen with the capacity price? Again, that's what, next slide, is there another slide after this? This is coming from someone that's trying to sell us capacity, all right? So what they're saying is, buy capacity now. Why buy capacity now? This is the Michigan capacity outlook. Top line, peak hour. Bars, the amount of capacity that we have installed. The right, the left chart, and this is a pretty busy chart, but the left axis is in megawatts. The right axis is in percent reserve margin. All right. So what's a reserve margin? The reserve margin is the difference between that peak hour need and that amount of capacity that's out there. If you remember, we try to maintain historically 20, 30% capacity margins. That number is down to 7%. And that circled area there is when the capacity reserve margin goes to zero based on this calculation. So at that point in time, I forget what the year is, 2023, you can expect, if this estimate is right, a drying up of available capacity in the marketplace, because the excess capacity, i.e. the difference between our installed capacity and the reserve margin after, or excuse me, the reserve capacity level that's installed, it is equal to, in essence, we have no excess reserve for sale in 2023. And that would imply that the cost of capacity on the market is going to go to cone, the cost of new entry, which is exactly what happened in the auction this year, because there was no available capacity for 2023 and 2024. So the price went to essentially the cost of a new build. So again, good information. This is the type of stuff that you want to look at when you're talking about buying capacity on the marketplace. What Pat was talking about, when you buy renewables, you have to buy capacity, more capacity, because renewables don't come with capacity. So you buy a 10 megawatt solar panel, you only get 5 megawatts of capacity. You need to go out on this market and buy the other 5. So that's how the market. That's how the market.
What was cone? What was the cone at the peak?
Cone this year is $7.68 a megawatt, or excuse me, a kilowatt month. All right. Yep. So that's the price of capacity when there's nothing available. MISO basically auctions capacity that it doesn't have at the cost of new entry. All right. And that cost of new entry is determined at what the cost is to build the quote cheapest resource available, which is a simple cycle natural gas combustion turbine of 250 megawatt size. We are actually competitive with Cone at installing our RICE units on Harbor Island, because that we're looking at about $6 and a little less, right around $6 for the installation of that capacity on Harbor Island, fixed for 20 years. So that's the other thing that you get when you install the capacity for 20 years. We are paying $6 a kW month for the entire life of that debt service, and then it's free after that. So buying capacity, fixing the cost, it fixes it at $6. Is that a good investment? Well, not compared to today's price at $5. You might want to buy some more. But if you escalate $5 at 3% per year for 20 years, somewhere around year 7, that $5 is going to be greater than the cost that you installed the unit for at $6.50 or $6. And now you have, for the remaining life of that resource, a cheaper resource than what's available in the marketplace. So again, there's a lot of thought, a lot of study, a lot of investigation that goes into it. This is one piece of that MPPA provides, and this was actually provided by Advanced Power, who's trying to sell us capacity. Right. So this is their take on it.
Yeah. Good sale.
Right. Next thing on the agenda, just a couple pictures there I wanted to talk about. Any other questions on that? Thanks for indulging me a bit more. We just got a couple pictures we wanted to show you as well. We did have a drone flight over Harbor Island. This was part of the demolition contract. Contractor did come in with a drone, flew the site. Couple pictures here from, this is a picture looking actually northeast a bit. Next slide. This is a picture looking southeast, and that kind of block of barren dirt there. That is the Sims Unit 3A and 3B CCR impoundment that we're talking about, or ash impoundment that's been cleaned up. And you can see very clearly here that, we have cleaned that up, removed all of the CCR material, and we've actually done quite a bit of testing on that. And we're working with Eagle right now to finalize that closure of those two ash ponds. The area directly to the left of our substation, you can see the area directly to the left of that is our new substation. And then the area to the left of that is the old, what we call 1 and 2 impoundments that we're talking about as well. Next slide. This is a really interesting photo. I think this is the best one of the drone. That's why I put it in here. But you can see our coal yard here is flooded, not very deep. It's in the front of the picture there. You're probably a few inches, and it goes to maybe a few feet in the middle of that coal yard. But you can see all the coal. The only coal that we have is sitting up in a pile up there, and then a little area behind the buildings. But you can see the dirt to the south of those coal piles has all been cleaned. So for the most part, all of the coal has been removed here. And the coal area that, since we're down at kind of the liner area, it's filled up. And you guys, those that drove the site, saw this a few weeks ago, council members. But I think what this site this pictorial kind of gives you is kind of a futuristic look of what that island is probably going to look like. Is that area that's flooded, the coal yard, that's where we're looking at restoring that area into a wetlands. And that dividing line is almost kind of the dividing line of what we would keep and what we would turn into wetlands is about where that black line is occurring there. And if you can kind of just point kind of that diagonal, that's I don't know, right there. Yep, that diagonal, and then straight east-west when you get up a little further, right there. If you're seeing the pointer, that's kind of where the dividing line will be between development and non-development. And you'll see that the proposed location of facilities are essentially right on top of the pilings of the Sims power plant. So again, this was what the site would kind of look like. If you can envision it here, kind of a wetlands area taking up almost the majority of the site. And then some development directly in front of the new substation that we constructed on the pilings for the Sims site, for the Sims substation. And that's what's really being developed more. But and then those little buildings there to the south, I mean, obviously all that's going to come down, but those are some storage buildings that will kind of be where the parking lot is for the new facilities if we do move forward with that. So kind of gives you a good feel. I think it's a good view. Next slide. This gives you a direct aerial down view of the facility. And again, you can kind of see the coal yard is getting cleaned out there. You can see basically clean dirt instead of coal. I don't think anybody's seen that for 35 plus years, or actually probably 60 years, 60 or 70 years. And there's probably coal there before that, when there was a coal distribution area. So that's probably the first time you've seen clean dirt in that area for a very, very long time. Same thing in the north there where the coal ash pond has been cleaned out. That's the first time you've seen clean dirt there for probably 35 years. So again, we're starting to get down to seeing undeveloped property, at least undeveloped to the state it was when we acquired the property. So again, questions on that? I think I just wanted to include the drone pictures. I thought they were pretty cool. We actually have quite a few more, but I thought those were 4 that were worthwhile looking at. So any questions on that?
Up on the first picture, I can see some of the boat launch ramp looks visible. Where not too long ago, that was all underwater.
Yeah, we are seeing substantial. I mean, if you didn't know that, I live near the water and take walks on the beach. The water levels are down quite a bit, and you're seeing that here as well. You're right. Some portions of the site are appearing that have not appeared for a while. So the flooding is subsiding a bit. It's by no means low. It's still high, but it is not as high as it was. And you're right, Todd, that boat launch was almost entirely submerged a few months ago.
Motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion.
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Roll call.
Roll call.
You don't need one on that.
Aye.
1, 2. Oh, wow.
Have a good night, guys.
Thanks for it, guys.
Bye-bye.